It is my privilege to talk today to Professor Angela Stent, Professor of Government and Director of the Center for Russian, Eurasian and East European Studies at Georgetown University. You wrote an important book, The Limits of Partnership, talking about the U.S. Russian relationship. And my first question is, why do we need partnership with Russia? And you know, this is not an overly provocative question, because there are a lot of people in the US government, and you were part of the US government, who seem to think that Russia first is not that important, and to the extent it is important, it is not prepared to be very helpful. Do we need partnership with Russia, and if so, why?
We certainly do need partnership with Russia. And Russia is still the United States and Russia, the two remaining nuclear superpowers. And between us, we cannot really resolve a number of the world's major problems if we don't work together. And we're seeing that now in terms of Syria, in terms of Iran, in terms even of issues like terrorism, counterterrorism. So Russia is not always an easy partner for the United States, just as the United States is not an easy partner for Russia. But we have to work together. We are fated to work together. And we've seen that this year when there were plenty of reasons why the relationship deteriorated. But in the end, we are working together, and we will continue to work together. And those in the US political class who say that Russia doesn't count anymore, that it's not important, they're flat wrong. It has to be a partner, even though it's, as I say in my book, a cranky partnership.
Well, in your book, you make clear that there are two kinds of limits. First, there are what I would say structural limits, because of different interests, because of different historical traditions, because of different circumstances. But then there are also limits which are connected to US policy, to Russian policy. What are these limits? Can we do better than we're doing now?
Well, first on the structural limits, I would just emphasize that the fact that we are the world's two nuclear superpowers means that in some ways we're still living in a Cold War time warp. And we focus very much on these, if you like, 20th century issues. The kind of relationship that we don't have, that we would have to have, were this a better partnership, would be a much more fully fleshed out economic relationship. And we're not natural economic partners because Russia is mainly a raw materials exporter. It sells oil and gas. It sells military hardware. These are not things that we need to purchase from Russia. We're trying to improve the relationship. So structurally, this is, if you like, a very one-sided relationship. But then I would say the limits of partnership also go back to the fact that we do see the world rather differently from the Russians. That the Russians want to focus on the sovereignty of states. They stress that Russia is a status quo power. They look at the United States as a revisionist power, largely because they think we're invested in regime change, that we want to go around changing governments that we don't like. So one of the real limits to this partnership is the U.S. foreign policy in general focuses on the fact that we believe we represent certain values. And those values include democratization, free market, the rule of law, and human rights. And we believe that we have the right to pursue those issues when we interact with other countries. Russia doesn't see the world that way. It now says that the U.S. behaves as the old communists did, trying to go around and recreate the world in its image. So I think fundamentally one of the limits to the partnership is if you're going to interact with a country like Russia, a great power, do you focus on your mutual interests and try and pursue them? Or do you focus on values, on what's happening inside Russian society? And that's one of the very sore points that has been there throughout the 23 years since the Soviet Union collapsed.
Well, this is a major issue, clearly, because if your view of foreign policy is a view of Henry Kissinger, and you refer to Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft in your book, then you can try to have perhaps a more involved partnership with Russia. After all, the United States certainly does not share the values of Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia is considered one of America's closest allies. I was born in the Soviet Union, and I remember vividly back in 1959, I was still quite small, but I still remember on Russian TV, suddenly I see Vice President Richard Nixon appearing with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, at the first American exhibition in Moscow. And there were some very interesting exchanges between Khrushchev and Nixon. And Nixon said to Khrushchev at that time, "Mr. Prime Minister, I understand that you believe that Americans are going to live under communism." That was what Khrushchev had stated. And he said, "This is fine. As long as we accept that you have your system, we have our system, and we will not try to change them by force or coercion." So this is 59. Here we are in 2013, and now sometimes you get an impression that the American position is that in order to have good relations, we actually require other countries to move closer to our political system and to our beliefs. To what extent it is a problem in the U.S.-Russian relationship? And do you think that the Obama administration has the right mix of the focus on national interests and human rights, or would you prefer to see it differently?
Well, this has been a constant issue in U.S.-Soviet relations, in U.S.-Russian relations. Now, to your question about Saudi Arabia, let me just say, and of course the Russians will always say that the U.S. pursues double standards, that we criticize Russia for doing things that we don't criticize China for or Saudi Arabia. The Russians have of course said that Russia is a European country. They're a member of the Council of Europe. They have signed on to conventions, to agreements where they are supposed to adhere to these Euro-Atlantic norms, which of course China hasn't done, Saudi Arabia hasn't done. But it is true that I think the U.S. has in the past not been consistent in the way that it has criticized Russia for some things that happened domestically and not criticized some of Russia's neighbors. I go into this in the book, Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, because they're important strategic partners for the United States, at least in the war on terror. I think the Obama administration has been pretty skilled at dealing with these issues. The reset, when it worked, and it hasn't worked so well in the last year or two, explicitly differentiated between working with Russia on these common interests, like arms control, like Iran, like missile defense, like Afghanistan, and saying it was a two-track policy and it was separated from what was happening domestically in Russia. And it's been fairly quiet and reserved in what it has said about what's happening domestically. This has changed a little bit in the last year since, or the last couple of years since Mr. Putin reclaimed the Kremlin, and since he has thrown out the United States Agency for International Development and other U.S. NGOs. We've had the spat over the Magnitsky Act and the so-called Dima Yakovlev Act, which bans the adoption of Russian children, and I think by Americans. I think what we have to understand is we have to differentiate between the Obama administration and the U.S. Congress. The Obama administration, I think, has been fairly reserved. The U.S. Congress, if you look at the entire, again, 23-year period that I'm looking at, has not been a force for promoting better relations with Russia. Those people in the Congress who are interested in Russia have tended to be people who are highly critical. So things like the Magnitsky list, which bans visas and freezes the assets of Russian officials involved in human rights abuses, that originated in the Congress. It was not something that the Obama administration wanted. The Russians then retaliated with this legislation on adoption. So the administration, I think, understands it, but I think, we are a pluralistic system, and the Congress is very important, and they take a rather different approach to dealing with Russia.
One very important thing about your career is that in addition to being a leading academic, you, of course, were in several administrations. Your book covers a lot of ground. It really starts with almost the last days of the Soviet Union, and then it goes to the current period. You were in the Clinton administration at the National Intelligence Council. You were in the Obama administration, in the Bush administration, at the State Department on policy planning stuff. Tell us, if you look back, Clinton administration, Bush administration, Obama administration, who handled Russia better? And if you want, you of course may start with Bush 1, because you talk about his policy, and you seem to be a kind of favorably disposed to what Bush and his team were doing at that time. I am talking about Bush 41.
Right. So in my book, I discuss 4 resets that we've had that I count since the collapse of the Soviet